All right, Chelsea fans, welcome back to another episode. That's right, London's Blue Podcast. Hopefully your favorite Chelsea podcast out there and a part of the Man in Blazers Media Network. And boy, oh boy, the hot days of summer are still here. And we have our good friend Ben Jacobs back to talk about the finalization of the Felix deal. Conor Gallagher making his departure finally from Chelsea Football Club. Get a little bit of conversation about what's going on with the Osimhen and Lukaku deals, and also talk about the tons of outgoing business that Chelsea still have left to do in the window. But just, Ben, first off, the health check there, the sanity check. Are you doing well with just over 10 days left in the transfer window time of recording?
Yeah, I appreciate the health check. It's not much sleep. It's a lot of ginger beer. And obviously, it's not alcoholic, I promise you. It's technically ginger ale, but we call it ginger beer nonetheless. Yeah, feeling good. Feeling in control of the situation and feeling like it's going to be busy for Chelsea.
Yeah, as we kind of just start off this at the beginning, so we know that as of yesterday, on Monday, we found out that the parties, both Atletico Madrid and Chelsea, found the path forward on the Joao Felix deal. As we just maybe touch on that briefly, because it's going to feel like old news probably to people at the time at the top of this recording, how do you feel like the deal went down? Did Chelsea feel like they got the right terms for it in terms of what they were looking for? And, you know, how much of it was pressure to get the deal done so that the Gallagher deal could go through? Maybe on the crux of, was it more important to bring in Felix or was it more important to get Conor Gallagher out?
Well, I think whenever you do a deal, you get a bit of rewriting in hindsight, which is Chelsea wanted Felix, Atleti wanted Gallagher. We're going to hear a lot of that. I don't think one is because of the other, but they were linked due to the fact that Atleti signed Julian Alvarez. They committed to that initial 75 million euros outlay, and then they had to scramble to find a fee. And after Samu fell through, it was difficult and it was tense for a while. And there was a possibility, maybe there still is, that Samu goes elsewhere other than Chelsea, and that would have allowed Atletico Madrid to be a bit more bullish with Felix. But the simplest solution was always replace Samu with Felix, involve Mendes after the Neto deal. I think he orchestrated his role in that very clearly and very aggressively. And that allowed for, in the end, a deal that should suit all parties. From Atleti's point of view, remember, they didn't desperately want to lose Samu, but they did want to find a solution for Joao Felix. So now they've got their fee to cover their amortization. 50 million euros, I understand, is the base fee. And then there'll be some dispute over the add-ons. Atleti want to paint this as a 60 million euros deal. I'm not so sure. I think the deal is 50 plus 5. But to be respectful to all parties, let's bill it as 50 million euros plus add-ons, which I think that all sources agree on. And that means it's a little bit higher than the Samu number. It's roughly what Atleti wanted as a bare minimum, I would point out, because we've had previous windows and times where Felix has been 60, 70, 80 million euros. And I think if you look at it from how Chelsea want to move, they now have the ability to use Felix on the left or in a central position. They've got the ability to use Neto on the right or the left. They've still got Cole Palmer on the right. Christopher Nkunku can go right or left. Noni Madueke is still at the club. Mudrik's there on the left. Sterling's there on the left. They've got lots of options. And because they know what Felix can do from his loan spell, this was just a deal of opportunism. And I think Chelsea will be delighted with Felix at the price they're paying. I think Atleti will be relieved to have got Felix away permanently and taken his wages off their books. And Atleti were desperate to get both Alvarez and Gallagher, and now they're going to be able to unveil both of them on Wednesday.
So as we get to the point of this deal being concluded, I think, you know, we want to talk about outgoings as well, just from a knock-on perspective to the attackers that you mentioned, Madueke, Mudryk, Sterling. I mean, we've seen links for Sterling, but there's obviously a huge challenge with the wage structure that he's on and a market potentially being available there. We have Madueke, I think, who's had interest from other Premier League clubs over the start of the window, and maybe some of those clubs have already found their solution, so that list of suitors may have decreased over time. And then Mudryk doesn't seem to necessarily have a home and wasn't necessarily included in Maresca's plans for the first match of the season. What's your understanding about where those three sit in terms of maybe a ranking of where Chelsea which one would Chelsea like to move on, which one would Chelsea potentially like to loan, and which one would Chelsea like to keep?
Oh, wow. This is one of those sort of games we usually play in a pub when we've had a few beers. The whole keep, steal, and as I know the game anyway, marry is sometimes put into there as well. So we're going to have to work out what the three terms are if we're to play this game. I suppose it's rate, persist, and exit. So
perfect.
With Noni Madueke, I think we can say for the right offer, an exit will be sanctioned, and there is a willingness for Chelsea to persist, to use that word, with Noni Madueke. But if the right offer comes in, £35 million or so, then an exit might be sanctioned in the coming days, because there are options on that right-hand side, as I've already explained. And Newcastle still like Noni Madueke, so let's see whether anything develops. But Chelsea don't have an offer yet. And it may be that if Newcastle sign Mark Gahey for 65 or 70 million pounds, that their only option to do more business is a loan with an option or an obligation. And I'm not so sure with Noni Madueke, even loan and obligation, that will be one that Chelsea would want to sanction. Although you can understand why, for example, Newcastle may say, we did it for Lewis Hall, can we have a similar structure? And let's wait and see if in the final days or hours of the window, Chelsea bend on that. But it's not like they're actively transfer listing Noni Madueke. He doesn't fall into the Trevor Chalobah in the development squad. And I actually think that Madueke had a relatively positive pre-season. He scored 3 times, let's not forget. And that would have not been unnoticed by Enzo Maresca. With Mudryk, I still think it's a rate. And when you say he wasn't part of that first team, yes, not a starter, but on the bench ahead of Sterling. And I think that tells you everything. So Chelsea know they've invested big on Mudryk. If they get rid of him, they're going to lose money. They feel like he still has a high ceiling, and under this Maresca system could be a good fit. It's just a case of whether or not he can find an end product. And we've seen quite repeatedly Mudryk do what Mudryk does. Lightning pace, massive potential, gets you up off your seat, but then you immediately sit down because that final part to his game isn't quite there yet. But Chelsea want to give it more time. So I don't see any realistic possibility where Mudryk goes in the final days of the window, even with Felix arriving and Neto being able to also play on that left-hand side. And with Sterling, if we're being brutally honest, we probably should say Chelsea would endorse an exit, but you have to respect the Sterling position as well, which is that he wants to stay and fight and try and use Chelsea to boost his England chances, and still feels that there's a role there to play. And the irony is that if you look at the Chelsea model, then Mudryk is the player that fits with what they want to do. They've invested in him, and they're trying to get him to improve and hit his high ceiling on a lower wage. But if you only think of it in football terms, the Raheem Sterling removing the big wages on, which is one stumbling block that Chelsea may be willing to reduce and take off their books. If you see the profile of Sterling, and minus the age and the wage, in the short term, he's a good fit in this Maresca system. He's a player that Maresca knows well. And if he goes back to being the wide touchline-hugging winger that he was at Manchester City, he could be very effective. But you have to prioritise your assets from the bigger picture, the recruitment model, and the ownership strategy. And if Mudryk is the one that's frozen out instead of Sterling, then Chelsea lose money, and it goes against the philosophy of their model to back the younger players that are on lower wages compared to Sterling and that have longer, higher term potentials, whereas Sterling now is supposed to be at his peak. And therefore, he's going to be pushed further down the pecking order. So we now have to wait and see whether anybody can do a deal for Sterling. It's not easy when he's under contract and he's on a big wage. What I would say, though, is in the next few days, Sterling's going to get clarity. And instead of it being, you may or may not be part of the regular starters, he may have a much firmer indication. So it could go from, you're a valuable squad player, to perhaps your minutes are diminished. And that may lead Sterling to wonder whether it is better, if he wants to break into the England setup, to leave in the coming days. And the player will make a final determination. I'm told Sterling was told that he wasn't starting for Chelsea or in the squad on Friday, and he's now in a period of reflection, and further talks will take place. And then let's see whether he's included against Servette or not. There's also a scenario, remember, where at this stage of the window, if there's a possibility of a sale, you don't pick players because you don't want to risk them getting injured. So the reality for Sterling now might appear frozen out, but if the window shuts and he's still at Chelsea, it might be a slightly different situation. Juventus, the team that have been linked repeatedly, I'm told yet the Sterling camp haven't had a direct approach, but it is true that they're interested in Raheem Sterling. And it's also true to my knowledge that if Sterling gets the right project presented to him, he would take a wage cut. So it's not a given that the wages are going to stop Sterling from leaving. It's just a lot of things have to happen at this stage. He has to get an approach on the right terms for the right club and at the right wage. And then Chelsea would definitely sanction a sale. But there's a lot of movement still to come on this one, albeit in a reasonably short time frame. And then the last thing, interestingly, that I've heard, which surprised me, is that Aston Villa are monitoring the situation too. Now, Villa have lost Diaby and they wanted Joao Felix, remember. I'm not sure that it will gather legs at this point. It's very formative and Chelsea haven't had an approach. But just keep them at the back of your mind because Villa are going to be really busy in the closing days of the window. It might be Chalobah as well that they come for. And Joe Gomez is another one I'm told to watch from Liverpool. But Villa and Sterling, it's whispers at the moment. I don't want to get Villa fans or Chelsea ones overexcited at this stage. But that's another name along with Juventus that I can throw into the mix.
And I think the other big incoming, outgoing, we don't call them swap deals, but I guess we'll call them interlinked arrangements, as it were. But the Lukaku to Napoli and the Osimhen to Chelsea potentially, we know that that is something that's been bandied about for several weeks at this point. And there's also now the potential of PSG wanting to go for Osimhen after some injuries related to their attacking setup. So what's your understanding of the latest of that potential deal and the cascading impact of how much of this is relying upon Lukaku and Napoli finding a deal that's suitable and Chelsea and Osimhen finding a deal that's suitable and then the clubs agreeing to something with their valuation? Because it feels like that is always the biggest issue, is that there is never an agreement between the two sides as to what the true value is.
It's crazy because you cover the window and one thing was crystal clear at the beginning of the window. Victor Osimhen was going to leave Napoli. Napoli wanted the release clause or nothing. There were loads of suitors that were interested, that would consider it. And now we're at the end of the window and it's like, yikes. Not only could Victor Osimhen stay at Napoli, but if he leaves, it could be a loan, which is like a massive polar extreme, different position to at the beginning of the window and even at the middle of the window. And it shows you that things are getting a little bit tense at this point. So Chelsea, believe it or not, are the only active suitor at the moment. And we'll come on to Lukaku in a moment. But with Osimhen, we should view it separately and something that could, if it happens, be late in the window. Because at that point, Osimhen's going to be put under pressure to make a decision. And if the decision is basically stay at Napoli, and they may well have got a replacement in Romelu Lukaku by then, and either be frozen out or be unhappy and have a club that want to get rid of him because when he extended, they gave him a big wage. And now they don't want to pay that wage. They can't afford to. They gave him that big wage on the premise he would go. So if he stays, it's a big wage for Napoli. So there's a lot of things now coming together that suggest if Osimhen stays at Napoli, he's going to be very unhappy and disappointed. And if the only option at that point is a Chelsea loan with, let's say, an option, possibly an obligation if Chelsea make Champions League, then Osimhen's perspective on a temporary move might change. And he may feel it's better to go to Chelsea for a year, whether temporarily or permanently, and then reassess. And I suppose we had this with Lukaku, didn't we, with all his previous Italian sagas, where Chelsea wanted him out, Lukaku wanted to move, nobody could find a solution. He did a first loan to Inter, he did a second loan to Roma, and only now have they been able to resolve it. And Osimhen's position may change. But at the time of recording, Osimhen wants a permanent move. And that's the stumbling block in all of this. Because Napoli, if they can get Lukaku, would probably sanction a loan for Osimhen with an option to buy late in the window because it's their only other choice and because they want to get the wage off the book and they know that the player wants to leave. And Chelsea are playing upon all of that. And right now, there is no other suitor. But of course, in the next minutes or hours or days, that can change. PSG sources are adamant that they haven't yet started any fresh negotiations at the time of recording for Osimhen. Of course, we can't rule it out, but a lot of focus for PSG now is being put on Ademola Lookman, another Nigerian, and he is keen on the move, but Atlanta don't want to sell. And then if PSG return, it won't necessarily be because Gonzalo Ramos got injured and is out for about 3 months. They always wanted a traditional striker. It's just that the PSG talks with Napoli were roughly 80 million euros take it or leave it. And at that point, Napoli said, no, it's in excess of 100 million. And really, we point you towards the release clause. So there is an outside chance that PSG return 80 million euros again, take it or leave it late in the window. And then Napoli are in a position where they need the wage off the books. They accept a much lower offer. It's a permanent deal. And Osimhen's already agreed terms with PSG. That's one possibility. The other possibility is if Chelsea get a loan, then PSG might want the same loan, and then the player would have a straight choice to make. And again, he's already agreed terms with PSG. The last point I would make is you're going to hear a lot of Victor Osimhen is too expensive for Chelsea on agents' fees and wages. That's not my understanding. Chelsea will break their wage structure in terms of numerics if they can get the right structure for Osimhen. It's just the fact that he has to come in on now reduced terms. So don't look at what a player enters now as the fixed and final amount, because Chelsea are in a season without Champions League football. So therefore, anyone coming in now has to come in lower. And if they get Champions League football, you can almost look at it as their wage being bumped up to an agreed number. But now it's at a sort of 20-25% reduction, and everyone has to agree to that. So it's about Osimhen agreeing to something lower if he joins Chelsea permanently now, because Chelsea are in this cycle without Champions League football. But that's not to say that it can't go a whole lot higher if he ends up staying at the club beyond 1 year. So those talks are going to continue separate to Lukaku, and I think it's going to run on relatively late into the window. Separate to that's the Lukaku situation. The last Napoli offer was a loan with obligation for 30 million euros, and Chelsea are expected to reject that, and sources still say they want 40 million euros or more if they're to sanction a deal. And it might sound like a really weird thing to say, but there's so much time left in the window. I know to you and to me it's like, please let it end, let us get some sleep, let us stop refreshing our feeds to find out what on earth Chelsea are doing every 5 minutes. It's exciting, but it's exhausting as a journalist. But in window terms, this week is the week where you make somebody sweat, where you back off, where you say you've got another target, where you play a few games, and then you've still got plenty of time next week. So you are going to see a lot of tactics at this point, and there is still some time for some Osimhen twists. But I think Chelsea's position is clear that they'll only do Osimhen on the right terms. And at the moment, they're trying to finalise the parties Lukaku and then revisit Osimhen a little bit later down the line.
So kind of then switching to the fact that Chelsea still have a ton of business to do from an outgoing perspective. We know that there's a couple of loan slots already taken up, but there's individuals in the first team squad, and then also with a pretty extensive loan group that is currently just sitting, waiting out there in the wings, trying to figure out what happens next. But we know that players like Chilwell and Petrovic, as well as Chukwuemeka, were not necessarily involved in this first match of the season. It feels like there's some writing on the wall there. What's your sense of maybe those three? And then we can talk about the other large group of players that are still waiting for some resolution to their future for this coming season.
Not too much on Chilwell at this point, other than Enzo Maresca has basically said if he's not getting minutes, it might be better for him to go out. I'm told suggestions of Manchester United and Chilwell are premature at this point. I think Chilwell would prefer to stay in the Premier League, but it's interesting with Connor going to Atleti, maybe he's persuaded by a move abroad. It's probably a bit too early for Gallagher to be influencing him, but we're seeing a few go abroad at this point, and we wait and see whether Chilwell is prepared to try something new. More likely is that he'll stick to his guns. He's part of the first team squad. He'll try and get more minutes, and then he can revisit the situation in January or summer 2025 when there's a little bit more time. That's not going to be an easy one to get done between now and the end of the window. And let's see whether anyone makes an approach. When I asked Enzo Maresca in pre-season directly, he told me it's a delicate situation because Chilwell's not quite the right position on that left-hand side for what he's looking for as a left-back. Although if he inverts the right, then Chilwell can bomb forwards as a left-back. If he inverts the left, you would think you've got Cucurella and Renato Vega ahead of Ben Chilwell. And he is a left-back, Maresca told me, not a left midfielder in his thinking. So Chilwell's in a delicate position. In pre-season, Maresca had said delicate doesn't mean his future at the club is delicate. It means his position is delicate because they're struggling to fit But one is effectively the other, isn't it? If you're not fit for the system, you're not going to get minutes. If you're not going to get minutes, then your future is in a delicate position. And I think Maresca's more recent comments on Chilwell suggest, even though he was talking about players more generally, that Chilwell could leave the football club. But I'm not aware of anyone putting down an offer at this point. With Chukwuemeka, there's too much competition there. And I think he could go with Italy being a very viable destination. But time is ticking once again. And Chelsea are short on offers at this stage. So they might have to settle for a loan with an option or an obligation there. With Broja, I think it's clear that he's out of the group rather than potentially, if the window shuts, him still training and being part of the first team. By the way, with your Brojas, your Chalobahs, whatever, when the window shuts, it'd be very rare for a club to ostracize them. You separate them during pre-season so you can lower your numbers and also not to give false hope. But then naturally, if the window shuts, they would surely have to be back training with the first team. So it's one approach when the window's open and maybe a different approach afterwards, which is why a Chalobah may back himself if he doesn't go anywhere to fight his way back into the reckoning. Let's wait and see. But with Broja, Chelsea's position is changing and changing and changing due to the lack of interest. So it was 50 million, supposedly. Then it was 35 million, as I reported. Now it might be 25 or 30 million, or it might be a loan with only an option to resolve the situation and not leave themselves with too many players. And therefore, Broja to somewhere is looking likely, and it was supposed to be almost done last week. But I think now there's been some complications because as soon as Chelsea intimated a loan might be possible, you get a whole raft of new suitors that said no to a permanent deal coming back and saying, you know what, for a loan, we're back in. So Stuttgart are one, Ipswich are another, and let's wait and see whether anything develops in the final few hours of the window. I'd be very surprised if Broja doesn't go. When the Ipswich story first broke, those close to Broja had intimated that he wanted to assess lots of options and that Ipswich was not the most likely destination. But Ipswich are pushing, and since that intel, Broja and Ipswich have had a direct conversation. He's had the pitch. So now we have to understand whether or not he's prepared to do that deal because Ipswich are very keen. But Broja now, it's likely to be a loan with something, option or obligation, is not going to be short of suitors, and therefore it still would be very surprising if he's not gone by the end of the window.
And I think there are some other names floating out there still. I mean, we've got David Datro Fofana. We have, kind of being out there as well. I mean, Kepa is still a part of the Chelsea infrastructure at the moment too. So, I mean, there's some players who, would have been at one point considered, a first team candidate or maybe even on the fringes. But, I know there's some other individuals who probably likely will find a new home, I would guess. But again, this is a lot of players for the sporting directors to finalize a solution for with only 10 days remaining.
Yeah, not every solution is only on Chelsea or a buyer, it's on the player as well. So Trevor Chalobah is going to be picky. He's contracted until 2028. I think the Villa interest, as I said before, is concrete. I'm not aware of Fulham coming back in, even though they're still trying to replace Tosin. We know they've been focused on Joachim Andersen. You've got Newcastle. If Gay falls through, they could be somebody that out of nowhere come and bid for Chalobah. And Manchester United have obviously brought in Delete, so they're not likely to move either. But Chalobah's going to have options, there's no doubt. It's just whether they're right for Chalobah, because still, he'd like to stay in London. That's good news for Palace, for example. But he'd also like European football, and that allows Villa, but maybe he doesn't want to leave London. He would have gone to Bayern 12 months ago on a loan, but that fell through on deadline day. He didn't want to go to Nottingham Forest when Chelsea accepted a bid. So this is a player that isn't only going to be looking at Chelsea now and how he's been frozen out. He's going to look back to the back end of last season and say, well, if the window shuts and I'm back with the first team, you never know. Because on merit, he was a Chelsea starter under Maurizio Pochettino. And I think he does have the confidence in his own ability not to be just rushed out the door. Chelsea are looking for minimum 25 million, maybe even a little bit closer to 30 million. So let's wait and see what happens there. Bashir Humphries is off to Burnley. Leslie Okwuchukwu has gone to Southampton. Jordi Petrovic and Strasbourg is Chelsea's preference, but the player needs to decide whether that's good for his pathway or whether he's going to fall so far down the pecking order at Chelsea that he doesn't just want to be loaned to the sister club. Might be a good opportunity, though, for him to learn the style, become more of a ball-playing goalkeeper, spend more time outside of his box without the pressure. And I don't mean that as disrespect to Strasbourg, because there's pressure at any club you go to. You can't just be using a club as a guinea pig to get better. But the connection between Strasbourg's style under Rossignol and Chelsea will force him to play in the same way without the same pressure as Premier League. And then if he comes back and he's outstanding at it, he'll fancy his chances, because he was the number one ahead of Robert Sanchez at the back end of the season under Maurizio Pochettino. So Chelsea have got to convince Petrovic, but that's their preference, to send him to Strasbourg. And then from there, there's a raft of others. Even Axel Disasi seems frozen out at the moment, so that could be a realistic possibility. And David Datro Fofana, as you say, and there has been some interest from Leicester as well. Chelsea would rather not do that one on a loan. They would like a permanent sale. And this is just an example of the model, right? Because with Kepa, who would love to go to Madrid, but there's nothing at the moment, and Ancelotti said the window's shut. So I wonder whether Saudi will come back in there and there's any possibility. It won't be Al Ittihad, but I wonder whether he'll get another option in Saudi Arabia. But this is the difference between the model. Kepa, you're making a loss. They paid big money under the old regime. Now they have to find a solution. It's the same for Romelu Lukaku. But with Petrovic and with David Datro Fofana, if they go, and maybe even Noni Madueke, it's a break even or better, and it might be making a profit. So that's harsh, because we want to think of our footballers as human beings that are developed by Chelsea and are going to be given opportunities. But in this model, if we're being really cutthroat and looking at it from a strategic and a budgetary point of view,
Sure,
it's about coming at Chelsea's first team. So normally we have this with academies, right? Lots of competition, overstocking, big numbers, a tiny percentage make it. And Chelsea are kind of experimenting at development and first team level. And they're saying, well, also, we're going to overstock. And again, if the player makes it, great, we're playing the odds. We've got enough options. And if the player doesn't make it, on the new ones they're signing, we're going to cash in. So we're going to dine off our successes. We're going to dine off our, in inverted commas, failures, or the players don't make it for Chelsea. And if Petrovic was to go and make money, if Madueke was to go and make money, if Datro Fofana was to go and make money, then you would say that strategically and financially, the model works, because some of the players are going to succeed for Chelsea and some of them are going to barely feature for Chelsea. They're going to leave despite being on long-term contracts after a short period of time, but the club's either not going to lose money or it's going to make money that they can then invest in other players. And Mark Guy is another example, right? He's had a great pre-season. He's got this brilliant sort of old school Hulkish quality to him. And unless Osimhen arrives, he's likely to be a squad player. But if that didn't work in a year's time, after throwing him at the deep end and realising he's not Chelsea quality, I'm not saying anyone thinks that, because obviously when they're signing these players, they're not thinking, well, we won't be good enough, but we'll make money off him. They're always thinking they might break through at Chelsea. But if you sign 4 or 5 in the same positions, they can't all. So then again, if in a year's time he's sold, you're going to make more than 5 million quid or 6 million euros. So the model is sound, because financially you're not in a position where if the player doesn't work, you lose money. There's rare exceptions. Mudryk, if he doesn't succeed, you lose money, which is why they're persisting with him for a little bit longer. But the lion's share of these players, Chelsea will feel if they make it, great for Chelsea. If they don't make it, they cash in and they're able to reinvest that money. And the player has to understand that aspect, that they're in a model and there may be a possibility, despite a long-term contract, that they might not stay for that long because it's very competitive at Chelsea. And some players will be happy with that and back their own ability. And some might feel a bit like a commodity and choose, therefore, to join another football club where they're going to get more instant game time and promises that they're there to be a footballer, not to be either a footballer or a sold asset.
Yeah, it will be interesting to see, because it feels like there's a lot of opportunity to judge whether or not the Clear Lake model is or is not working. And I think there are ways to justify it on a books perspective, on a player development perspective, but then also on a footballing success perspective. And I think that is the missing part of the equation for this organization at the moment. If we look at the fact that if we judge success on trophies, on finishing in the top 4, on being in the Champions League, there is still a bit of a mountain to climb for this strategy to prove that it is going to pay dividends if we keep it with the financial terms for this type of strategy. And so I guess maybe rounding it out, last kind of final question to close it, how will the success of this transfer window be judged by maybe the Chelsea hierarchy of the sporting directors, given the amount of work that's still left to do? Is there any type of understanding you have on like if they don't get a certain amount of action done in these last 10 days, that it will be deemed to be, a sour end to this window?
Well, I think the window is part of what I've always reported and I still understand to be a 4-window plan. So at the end of this window, it will actually be judged on the last 4 windows. That's the first yardstick. The second thing will be, have they lowered the average age and lowered the average wage? And I think that's a tick. The third thing will be, have they bought young talent for the future? And I think that's a tick, with across the 4 windows, the likes of Kendry Paez and Esteval Willian. And that's informing also, remember, why some players are seen as surplus to requirements, because there's even more players to come in certain positions. And then Mike Penders is expected to get over the line. They're still trying for Gabriel Meck as well. So all of that's very positive. And I think they feel in a stronger position in their forward planning and for the future. And then I expect them to go to an even younger age group and focus on the academy. I don't think it will always be teenagers and young players. The irony is that if all these players succeed, they have longevity. So then the average age of the squad will go up. So it's not like they want a starting lineup as young as it is now. That's the starting point. And then the squad grows together and you buy less. So the sign of success after this 4-window plan will be Chelsea's movement in the market at senior level slowing down. Then I think where there are question marks are, or where there were question marks and maybe still are, they've wanted for ages wide player, traditional striker. And of course, Neto, Felix ticks the box of 2 wide players, and they know Felix well. And Neto, if he stays fit, should be an outstanding signing. So the last thing missing from this 4-window over $1 billion spending is maybe a more established striker. And I still think if they don't get one, they'll be relatively disappointed. But no doubt the club would argue they back Nicholas Jackson. They feel that Mark Guéhi has a role to play as well. But it's clear that right up until the end of the window, they will explore the market to see whether there's the right kind of more experienced, even if they're still young, striker that they can add, which is why they're still looking very closely at the Victor Osimhen situation. So if after all of this, they don't come out of the window with a more globally known striker name, maybe there'll be an element of disappointment, although, as ever, you're never going to say that as a club. There'll always be a backing for Nicholas Jackson and a feeling that having bettered Drogba's numbers in his first season at the football club, he can kick on. But I do think that they want one more. And if they don't get that striker across the 4 windows, then there'll be an element of disappointment. And of course, people will point to the fact that in the very first window, they got Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, and that was very much Thomas Tuchel signing. But remember, that's the 5th window. So this 4-window plan started after that first summer when Bowley was the sporting director. Then outgoings-wise, there will be a disappointment if they can't resolve Lukaku and Kepa in particular. And I think they'd like to bring in Broja as well. So the incomings they'll be delighted with for the future and now. And I think that's true regardless of whether they get a striker. But I'm sure the fans and people listening to the podcast will feel like it becomes more of a 9 or a 10 out of 10 window if Osimhen joins. And if Osimhen doesn't join, then maybe Neto made it an 8 out of 10 and Felix might make it an 8.5 out of 10 to some. But I think that generally most fans will be satisfied with the incomings if Osimhen arrives. With the outgoings at the moment, it's probably more a 5 out of 10 window that they're looking to turn into a 9 out of 10 window. And it is very important, regardless of who those outgoings are, that they have to lower the squad size significantly. And that might mean compromising on certain deals. And I think the other thing with the outgoings is the financial aspect, right? So if they can have, believe it or not, a net spend of 0, then that is probably the financial aim. And I think right now it's about, and forgive my maths if it's slightly off, 240 million spent. And then if you add the Gallagher fee to the 85 million or so in outgoings, you're looking at about 115 in. So there's, give or take, let's just call it 120 million odd. Also, assuming Gallagher's finalised, it would be more like 100 million difference between what they've spent and what they've sold. So how do you bring in that other 100 million? Well, Lukaku might be 35 or 40. Broja could be 25 or 30. Chalobah could be 25 or 30. Chukwuemeka could be 25. Chilwell could have a fee. So there's lots of ways of getting there, where actually at the end of all of this, if they only got Osimhen on a loan with no commitment, their net spend, believe it or not, could be zero. And then on their books for 23-24, you've still got the 55 million for Mason Mount, which did not go on 22-23. It's on 23-24. So you could even add that into the calculations as well. But I think financially speaking, Chelsea at the end of the window, with all these outgoings they need, will want to be close to a net spend of zero. Of course, if they pay a big fee for Osimhen, it won't be possible. But if they get Osimhen on a loan with an option, then it is very possible that that net spend might be something in the region of 240, 250 million pounds spent. And maybe 200, 250 million in terms of outgoings. And again, I preface that based on it's 85 million. If Gallagher is completed as expected and he's on his way to Madrid, that is another 32, 33 million. So you're already over the 100 million mark. You could technically add the 55 million from Mount, and then you could theoretically bring in another 100 million plus still between now and the end of the window if some of the deals we've spoken about come off at the fees suggested. And therefore, it would be a surprise at the end of all of this if Chelsea aren't somewhere close to that net spend zero, presuming they don't pay some astronomical fee for Victor Osimhen. And if they get there, that's a financial success. If they don't get anywhere close to that net spend zero, then I think they might be a little bit disappointed.
Well, that is going to be the challenge. 10 days, 100 million. No easy task set in front of the sporting directors.
But if you say it's 100 million, it sounds hard. But if you say Lukaku, loan with obligation.
Yep.
If you say Chalobah, lots of interest. If you say Broja, almost certain to go. We haven't even mentioned David Datro Fofana. So there is a way of getting to that number, but there's two separate points here. One is maybe they bring in 100 million and only 3 go. Maybe the other thing is that you compromise with loans and lower fees and 6 or 7 go. But in that scenario, maybe they don't get their 100 million. So that's the sort of paradox and the irony here, that maybe it's 3 sales, maybe it's a financial success for outgoings, but the squad size is too big. Or maybe it's the opposite, 6 or 7 go, but they have to compromise with non-permanent deals. So the squad goes down, that's a tick. But financially speaking, the net spend isn't anywhere close to zero. So only they know at this stage it's going to be manic, it's going to be spinning multiple plates. But let's see whether they can get somewhere near that goal of a net spend of zero come the end of the window.
Well, we will definitely be keeping an eye on it, as well as your updates over the next set of days here. And hopefully the club don't force you into too many additional cans of ginger beer there to keep you healthy, keep you sane, and keep you reporting, as you always do, fantastically on what's been going on. But we appreciate you coming back on to give us an update. And look, plenty of more opportunity for news to drop over the next 10 to 11 days here as we kind of round out the transfer window. But that's going to do it for this episode and this update. So thank you much to Ben, and thank you for listening. But until next time, Chelsea fans, you know what to do. Keep the blue flag flying high.